Okay. Good evening, Rabbi Zobin. So we are trying to work through the explanation of Abaya's explanation of Rava, basically. In other words, what Rava means when he compares Tumah to Muktza, and we saw Tosfos. We really saw two pshatim so far. We saw Tosfos who says that if something is Mekabel Tumah, were something able to Mekabel Tumah through Yichud, then it wouldn't be. Then it would be considered a Keli, or wouldn't be Muktza in Inyan Shabbos, even though he hasn't yet been Yachid it. It's the potentiality for Yichud that's significant. That's Tosfos' reading of the Sugya. And then we saw the Ran, who equates Tumah and Muktza more fully, and says the explanation is that that by using something on Shabbos, you're effectively imbuing it with that use, and therefore both with respect to Shabbos and with respect to Muktza, it ceases to be Muktza at that point because you've given it a use. When the Gemara says you can move it l'tzorech gufay, it doesn't mean the general rule of it's a Muktza item like a hammer that's a klisha Machat issa, it can be used as a l'tzorech gufay l'tzorech mekomo. Rather it means that by using it for its function, it ceases to be Muktza because you've given it a function. You've given it that functionality. Now, normally, the whole point of Muktza is that you can't give something a functionality you can't give something a functionality on Shabbos. And the chiddush here is that this golem, this as yet incompletely manufactured Machat, by just using it, you can give it its purpose. Now, Jeffrey pointed out to me after Shiur that I sort of hadn't done sufficient housekeeping on the run, so there are bits and pieces that we need to sort of tidy up in order to work this through properly. But that's either way. That's what the run says. That's not controversial. That's what the run says. Now, so the first thing, just conceptually, and then translation. The run is not saying that you can be miyachid for a function, stones or other klisha melachot muktza on Shabbos. The whole point of Muktza is that if something doesn't have a function before Shabbos, it's Muktza, and it remains Muktza over Shabbos. And indeed, that's the explanation of Shivrei Kelim, which Adam Zorek Bein Ha-Grotos. And the point is that it becomes like a stone and therefore has no functionality at all. The chiddush of the run is simply that that you have this very nuanced mid-tier Muktza, which on the one hand is the most chomo form of Muktza. It's not even yet a Keli, it's as yet an unformed Machat, it's a golem, and therefore it's not a klisha Machat issa, it's a Muktza machmas gufay. Nonetheless, the chiddush of being mid-production process is that it has enough latent functionality waiting to burst out that you can use it on Shabbos, and by using it, make it into a Keli. That's the chiddush of the run. That's a summary of what the run says. Now, the run almost explicitly says something which is a little bit difficult in the language of the Gemara, but this is what the run says. So I can simply quote what he says, because the Gemara. Let's have a look back at the question on Rava, which Abai is coming to answer on Rava's behalf. Masechet, says the Gemara, Machat bein nekuva bein she'einu nekuva, mutzah b'taltelu b'Shabbos. A Machat, whether it's nekuva or not nekuva, you're allowed to move it on Shabbos, meaning to say whether it's a regular Machat, which is a Kli, or it's an as yet incomplete Machat, it's really just a bit of snipped wire, and it's still a golem. Nonetheless, it's waiting to be made into a Keli. and therefore if you begin using it on Shabbos, that makes it into a keli. In either case, Muktza l'tal to the Shabbos. You're allowed to move it on Shabbos, either because it's not Muktza or because by using it, you make it non-Muktza. They only said that you need Nekuva with respect to Tumah. The Ran translates as, if a keli is just sitting there, which is what happens with Tumah, you're not using it to make something Tommy, you just touch it, or it's sitting in an oil with a mace, or whatever the case may be. That's the din that it's only Mekabel Tumah if it's Nekuva was only said with respect to Tumah, because with respect to Tumah, it just sits there, it just is. And in the meantime, you haven't made it into a keli. But Enochanami and Eina Nekuva, even though the Brisa says that only a Nekuva can become Tommy, it would agree that an Eina Nekuva can become Tommy if you actually use it. Because if you actually use it, it becomes a kli. Now, this is a little kvetched, it's a little pushed into the language of the Brisa, but that's what the Ran says this explicitly. And the language of the Ran is, he says that Tumah and Shabbos ki'atadinenu, d'miyad k'shemachashiv eleh litloi havelei kli u'mutzah l'tal tzarei, v'achanami t'la'achar mikan havelei kli nami l'inyan Tumah. After you use it, it's a kli d'Tumah. Because you didn't think about it, and Tumah touched it, it's tahor. So when the Brisa says that v'lo omru nekuva elo l'inyan Tumah, that's another way of saying if kol zaman that lo choshav aleh, if it's Eina Nekuva, it's tahor, it's not a keli. And when the Brisa says that you can move it in Shabbos, that's another way of saying that when you were choshev aleh and you begin using it, then it does become a keli. So that's how the Ran has quite a conceptual reading, in other words, of this halachic statement. When it says that if you can use it on Shabbos, the translation is by using you make a keli, it's a keli. When it says that a non-nekuva is not makabel tumah, the translation is that without using it, it isn't a keli. That's how the Ran translates it. It is what it is. In other words, the Ran understands this to be a reasonable reading, and we can hear it and not hear it as you choose. I mean, it's a difficult reading, but that's what the Ran is teaching us, that this is a way to read the Brisa, that when it references Muktza, it means by using it, you make this non-knock of needle into a keli. And when it says Tumah, it means by not using it, it's not yet a keli. It just so happens that by Shabbos, the whole point is you're using something. And by Tumah, the whole point is it just sits there and it gets touched. And therefore, with respect to Tumah, it's not a keli. With respect to Shabbos, it is a keli. Is another way of saying unused, it's not a keli. Yes, used it is a keli. That's how the Ran reads things. The second bit of housekeeping that so far is that okay? Yeah. Okay. The second bit of housekeeping that I didn't do was Tosfos's question, and I'm sort of going to duck this next point. I just want to mention it. Tosfos, what led to Tosfos's reading of the Gemara, in which he said that when a buyer in Rava equates Tumah and Muktza, what he really means to be saying is that something which with respect to Tumah, if you're miyachid, it can become Tommy, then with respect to Shabbos is not Muktza even without being miyachid it. What led him to say that, his kasha from Tosfos's question from the Kamon, where we say kol hakelim hanitolim shivrei nitolim, that's shivrei kelim on nital, and Rashi there explains that that's only where it's nishba al yedei, that's only where that's only al yedei yichud. So that's Tosfos's question. Tosfos says that why would it be that there it's only on Yidei Yichud when Al Gemara seems to say it's not Muktza at all? So there's no, Al Gemara also means it's not Muktza on Yidei Yichud. That was the launch pad of Tosfos's whole explanation. How would the Ran answer that question? The Ran never bothers getting back to that. He never deals with that question. He never says anything. And as according to the Ran, how would the Ran explain that kol hakelim netolim shivrei netolim imoim? Shivrei kelim are also not makabel tumah without yichud, and even so, the Brisa says that with respect to Shabbos, you can move them. So the only explanation is that the Ran would have to pick a fight with the Rashi that Tosfos quotes, and would also learn that that shivrei kelim with respect to Tumah also don't need yichud. I think that's the only way you can you can learn in the run. So again, I'm sort of putting that on hold because it's really a later Gemara. It's not Gemara that we've looked at in depth. I'm just saying for the mass of the sugya, the very imperative that drove Tosfos, which is how do you answer the Gemara later of Shivrei Kelim, the run doesn't bother getting to and addressing. All I would point out is that Tosfos' question is built on an assumption that Shivrei Kelim need yichud. The run could pick a fight with that assumption. So I think that's just tidying up the bits of housekeeping that we need to do in the run. The run never addresses that, deals with that question in essence. Yeah.
Would we feel uncomfortable using the same idea the run presents a Machat to change something also with Shivrei Kelim? Shivrei Kelim can now be used with Machat.
The problem is then that it ends up that Muktza, with respect to Tumah and Muktza, again, you've got the identical thing. Because, one second, let me just work out the maths of that. Kol HaKelim Nitolim, Shivrei Nitolim.
Only once you've used Machat, then now you can take them and now they become.
Tosfos says that with respect, Tosfos quotes Rashi as saying it's not a keli, it's only a keli with yichud with respect to Tumah. And there the Brisa says that Kol HaKelim Nitolim, Shivrei Nitolim. So saying that maybe the Ram would learn that also means, no, it's the exact opposite way around to what I'm saying. That it's nittel by using it as a keli. And Kol HaKelim Nitolim, Shivrei Nitolim, is not the same nitolim between Kol HaKelim nitolim means they can be nittel mechama l'tel l'tzorech mekomam. Shivreim nitolim would mean only with machshava or only l'tzorech gufam.
That's similar to what you said here.
Yeah, but here it doesn't result in an eight. I hear your point, and I'm not sure you're wrong. Actually, you may well be right. The reason I didn't say this was because it's an asymmetrical reading.
Yeah.
Kol HaKelim nitolim means the keli can be nittel just stum, with nothing at all. Shivreim nitolin means only l'tzorech gufam, in other words, only if I begin using them for a purpose. Machat bein nekuva, which is a klisha melachot le'isa. Okay, but at least it's Muktza still. So Machat, you're correct. It's a fine point you're making. But Machat, according to the Ran, when it says Machat bein nekuva bein she'eino nekuva mutzah l'talus b'Shabbos, it means Machat nekuva can be moved in line with klisha melachot le'isa, and Machat she'eino nekuva means only for its use, at which point it ceases to be Muktza. But at least both are Muktza. So Machat nekuva is a klisha melachot le'isa. So you can't stum move it mechama l'tel, just for no reason or just to protect it. And Machat she'eino nekuva is a full Muktza till you begin using it for its purpose. Whereas Kol HaKelim is a stretch further. It's Kol HaKelim are not at all Muktza, and Shivreim is you can make them not Muktza by using it for their purpose. You're correct though, really. Maybe once the run's willing to say one, he's willing to say the other. So I don't know. I need further thought. In my mind, I sort of separated the two because the gap's more extreme. But I'm no longer convincing myself. Never mind anyone else. So I'm not sure. It needs thought. Okay, again, just to summarize, so we're not left completely in the tangle. The run doesn't directly address Tosfos' question, in which Tosfos assumes that Shivrei Kelim are mutter without yichud, and Tumah Shivrei Kelim are only Tomei with yichud. That was Tosfos' whole question. The run doesn't tell us how he would answer that. So we can jump, now I'll say it differently, we can jump one of two ways. Either the run would argue with Rashi and hold that they become Tumah even without yichud, or the run would say that Muktza and Tumah are identical, and in both cases they need yichud by, as per this sugya, by using it, that's a yichud of sorts. And when it says that Shivrei Kelim and Tolim, it means gufa, by using them, you make them not Muktza. Whether you're happy with that in the language of Kol HaKelim Nitolim, also Nitolim, that use the same language of Nitolim, over to you, Rabbi. So I'm no longer sure. I sort of assumed it was a poor reading in the poor reading, but it's a fair point. That maybe not. Maybe that's what the run means. So it bothers me a little bit. But the truth, yeah. Sorry.
There are other problems as well. How we see that sugya is not so clear that you can be Shivrei Kelim can be taken on Shabbos without being before Shabbos. Things like that. So the run,
okay, that's a separate, yeah.
But even the run is almost suggesting give the Machat it has an equivalent. You can just have Machat on Shabbos and take it. But it doesn't work later on. So there is a disconnect.
No, because that's Shivrei Kelim. This is yeah, I mean, this is the other reason why this is the other reason why I hadn't drifted towards your svara, though it needs more shekel adas. The whole lomdus of why the Ram thinks you can have something which is really is Muktza machmas gufa, it's a stone, yet can be miyuchad on Shabbos, is because it's in production process. Shivrei Kelim on production process, as per the Machat. But again, I don't know if that's a knockout blow. I mean, once the Ram says this chiddush, maybe you could extend this chiddush to useful Shivrei Kelim. The point of the broken Machat is that Adam Zoreik Lebein Agatized, you're not planning to use it anymore, but Shivrei Kelim, which maybe could be used for other things, that's the whole point of Shivrei Kelim, why they're not Muktza. So maybe the Ram would say they're only not Muktza by beginning to use them. Okay, it needs further thoughts. Okay, so is everyone? Does everyone follow the discussion? Yeah, how exactly to take it out? I don't know. Okay, there is a third reading in the sugya that I just want us to work through, which is the run that I printed, the run on the Rif. Sorry, we call this the third reading. Maybe others shown him also, but the run on the Rif seems to say this, in which he seems to say that there's a chiluk basically between the death of Kelim and the birth of Kelim, and that's how he understands Abaya's answer according to Rava. That when it comes to the birth of Kelim, where we're looking forward to potential, there Shabbos and Tumah are not identical. Tumah asks you, is the Keli yet a Kli? Shabbos asks you, is the Keli on the way to becoming a Kli? Is it about to become a Kli? And that's enough to stop it being Muktza. So Rava never meant to compare Tumah and Kelim to each other with respect to the birth of Kelim. All he meant to do was compare them with respect to the death of Kelim. In many ways, it's the simplest answer in the Gemara. When it comes to something being ruined as a Keli, there, why should Shabbos and Tumah be any different? What ruins it as a Keli for one is what ruins it as a Keli for the other. In other words, Tumah is about, is it a Keli or isn't it a Keli? Shabbos is about, is it omed for human use? Is it omed for use or not? So when the Ram is arguing that when it comes to the birth of Kelim, something's on the way to becoming a Keli, there you can distinguish between Shabbos and Tumah. That's how he understands Abaya's answer. Because there it makes sense to say it's not yet a Keli, so therefore it shouldn't be Tommy, but it's on its way to become a Keli, and that's enough to say that for Shabbos it's omed for servitude, for use. But when it comes to the death of Kelim, in other words, something being ruined as a Keli, why should Shabbos and Tumah have a different switch-off point? When it becomes useless for one, it becomes useless for another. That's Abaya's answer for Rava. When Rava equated Tumah and Shabbos, he only meant with respect to the death of Kelim, not the birth of Kelim. I think is that a fair summary of the run on the Rif. Yeah. Okay. Tosus says that something not massively different in practicalities, but the Lomdus is different. Tosus says that with respect to Tumah, it's the ability to be miyachid it that makes it Tomei. The Ram may not agree with that. The Ram may say, even if you can't be miyachid it, the point is that since it's in process, that's already enough to make it the servant of a human, and therefore cease to be Muktza. The thought behind it is similar, but they're not fleshing out in the same way. It's yeah. Tosus, we saw already you can say Tosus in two variants. We can either say the possibility of yichud, even the likelihood of yichud. The Ram doesn't mention any of that. He just says, I'm adding a bit into the Ram on the Rif. The Ram on the Rif doesn't quite say what I just said. The Ram says the maths of what I said. He doesn't explain the Lomdus behind it. He just says that Abaya, when he came to the fence of Rava, he doesn't even quite say that, by the way. I mean, I didn't want to get drawn into the complexity of the Maram and the Marshal, but in my slight misquote of the Ram, all the Ram is saying is that when it comes to Abaya's answer and Rava, is that there's a difference between the birth and the death. He doesn't explain the Lomdus, but I think the Svara is that when you're talking about something becoming useless, why should there be a difference between Shabbos and Muktza? When talking about something becoming a Keli, for Shabbos it's enough that it's become a potential Keli, it's on its way to being a Keli, because it's now the servant of human need. Whereas for Tumah, it has to actually be a Keli. That I think is what the run is saying. Does that seem a reasonable reason? Okay. The final point I want to make for today's share is really I found really fascinating is discussion, which is I printed from the Chasam Sofer, and in brief, by the way, just if you were finding the sources a bit overwhelming, all I was bringing for the Mashar and the Maram Shik and everything else is just a lot of laborious hashman in what exactly the run on the Rif means. Because the run on the Rif it's very murky, the comments he makes, and there's gis and messes as to exactly what he said. If you didn't manage to work your way through the Mashar and the Maram Shik, don't worry. I'll simply say that there's a run that arguably says this point that I said, and whether he actually says it or not is unclear, but at least a possible reading and a possible gesa of the run on the Rif is that he says this third reading, this third malach in the sugya. Okay, so I guess just to summarize, just so we don't leave completely unclear, we basically have a Tosfos that says the point is that if it's makabel tumah al yedei yichud, then if it could be makabel tumah al yedei yichud, then it's not Muktza. That's Tosfos. We have a Shitaran who says that Shabbos and Tumah are identical. If you, with respect, in this narrow area, with respect to a Kedi, on the way to becoming a Kedi, then even though it's a stone until it becomes a Kedi, nonetheless, if you begin using it, it becomes a Kedi, and that makes it into a Kedi with respect to Shabbos and Tumah, and there's no difference between the two. But the way that's phrased in the Gemara is that with respect to Shabbos, you can use it because that makes it into Keli, whereas Tumah, which isn't about use, but is about a state of being, it won't become Tumah because you're not using it. That's the Shittul Run. And finally, we have a Chidusha Run on a Rif, which arguably says that Abaya's teretz is quite neat and simple, which is with respect to the death of Kelim, things becoming useless, it makes sense that Tumah and Shabbos are the same cutoff point. With respect to the birth of Kelim, you need to ask yourself a different question, which is, with respect to Shabbos, is it already the servant of a human being? With respect to Tumah, has it yet become a Keli? That's how we're learning, arguably, the third pshat in the Sukkah, take it or leave it. So that's I think the maths of the Rishonim on the Sukkah, as far as I'm concerned, tidied up. I now just want to use our remaining time for a very interesting Chasam Sofer on the Sukkah. And the Chasam Sofer asks, it's a fascinating question. A Machat which isn't Nokov, but isn't Muktza. How would you have a Machat that isn't Nokov but isn't Muktza? Well, it depends on everything we've been talking about. It depends on the Machlokas Amoraim and it depends on the Machlokas Rishonim. But either it's not Muktza, that's what some Amoraim hold, that a Machat that's not Muktza that's not Nokov, isn't Muktza because it can be used for de-thorning yourself, or at least with Yichud, it becomes a de-thorner. Okay. However, it becomes not Muktza, it's fascinating because a Machat that is not Nokov only has one use, which is de-thorning. And that's mutter to do on Shabbos, that's the whole point of the Sukkah. So it's a Klisha Malachtoi La Heta. You now put a hole in the Machat, which makes it a better Keli, and now it gets its primary purpose, which is as a sewing needle, and now it switches to become a Klisha Malachtoi La Issa. That's just it's correct halachically seemingly, but it feels somewhat paradoxical that you make it more useful and therefore it becomes more Muktza on Shabbos, right? But that's the point that the Chasam Sofer asks us to think about, and that's what he says. He says that seemingly the Machat, which is not Nokov, would be a Klisha Malachtoi L'Hata. In other words, you can move it around willy-nilly, just Mechamel itself, from the sun to the shade. Whereas once you're Nokev it now becomes a Klisha Malachtoi L'Issa because it's now a stitching device, and you're not allowed to sew on Shabbos, and therefore its primary purpose is a Kli Malachtoi L'Issa. He then says that doesn't seem to fit well the language, because the language of the Brisa is get Gemara out again, so put it away. Machat bein nekuva bein she'ein nekuva mutter l'taltel b'Shabbos. And according to this svara, Machat nekuva is only mutter l'taltel as a klisha malachtoi le'issa, and Machat she'ein nekuva is mutter l'taltel completely because it's not Muktza at all. Therefore, the Chasam Sofer says not like that. That's the That's the svara of the Chasam Sofer. Yeah. So that's a summary of the Chasam Sofer. He says misvara, as soon as I miyachid it to use as a decoating device, it's not Muktza at all. It becomes a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter, and it's more lenient than the Golem, but also more lenient than Kli Shemanachta L'Issa. And then he says it doesn't seem to fit the language of the Gemara. Now, over this Nakuda, a fair amount of halachic ink has been spilt, because what would be the counter argument? I mean, what's wrong with this logic of the Chasam Sofer? Why would it be? Is everyone with me so far in the reasoning going on over here? Yeah. So l'chora. Yes, but why? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So when you have a golem of a needle, it's Muktza. Either automatically or through a yichud process, it becomes a decoating machine. It's used as a dethorner. So by logic, we would say that's a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter, because you're allowed to dethorn on Shabbos. You put a hole in it, and that goes back to being a needle, which is primarily used for sewing, and therefore goes back to being a Kli Shemanachta L'Issa. That's the Chora one would say. The Chasam Sofer dismisses that because he says he doesn't think it fits in the language of the Brisa. The Brisa says Machat, bein Shen and Metaltalin, which seems to sound like the same level of tiltal. It must be they're both a Kli Shemanachta L'Issa. Okay, but why? Why would a needle which is only made for dethorning be Kli Shemanachta L'Issa? It's not true. It's a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter. That's what's wrong with that? Sorry. In other words, what is the logic? What's the counter logic over here?
Most of these things are being produced to become needles.
Okay, I think that's excellent, but I think out of that emerges a fascinating thing. It becomes a kli because you could use it to dethorn, but it doesn't become a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter because it's not made for actual heter yet, because it hasn't actually been used for heter, and most of them are going to go on and become needles. So, in other words, let's put this in the neatest mathematical summary. I thought till now that Kli Shemanachta L'Issa meant a keli which is made for an Issa use, and Kli Shemanachta L'Heter meant everything else. I now see that's not true. Kli Shemanachta L'Heter means it's made for a mutter use. If you have a keli which isn't made for a mutter use, but also isn't made for an issa use because it's not yet holed and therefore can't yet be used for sewing, that's also a Kli Shemanachta L'Issa. It's not a Kli Shemanachta L'Issa that has a positive Kli Shemanachta L'Issa, but it doesn't have a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter. In other words, anything which isn't a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter is by default a Kli Shemanachta L'Issa, and therefore can't be used. It can't be moved willy-nilly for no reason. I find that very interesting. So, are you with me here? Again, this needle is not Muktza. Why is it not Muktza? Because I could use it for dethorning. It's not a normal use for it though. You can't call it a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter that's made for that. But you could use it for that, and therefore it's enough that it's the servant of human use, because you could use it for that it's a Kli, but it isn't really made for its heter use. Now, I thought, perhaps stupidly so, that Kli Shemanachta L'Issa means the point is that it's a servant, it's a Kli, but it's used for other things on Shabbos. That's what makes it Muktza. It's used for sewing if it's a needle, or cooking if it's a pot. But this piece of wire is not made for anything osa, because it's not yet a good sewing machine. But nor is it particularly made for anything mutter. It's just a servant, it's a Kli. A default Kli that isn't made for heter or issa is treated like a Kli Shemanachta L'Issa, according to this maskana of the Chasam Sofer. I find that very interesting. And just for your information, maybe I'll try and put sources on the group. This is actually a big machlokes achronim in Halacha. If you have a Kli that isn't made for issa or for heter, do you jump and say it's a Kli Shemanachta L'Heter or Kli Shemanachta L'Issa?
So one of the things we discussed was how much of a yichud was needed. If you had two factories next door to each other, and one was producing dethorning devices and one was producing needles, and the needle ones were stopped on Shabbat before they were pierced, then you would essentially have identical things in the two separate factories. Would it be enough that one factory was called the dethorning factory and those things were never ever intended to go?
I really don't know, and these are very interesting questions. What defines something's used, and how does that work? I don't know the answer to the question. Here, we're in easy territory because the Gemara tells us it can be used for a thorn. It's not a normal thing to use it for a thorn, but I don't know at what point something shifts to and who has ownership on defining what the normal use of things are. I don't know. Very complicated questions. Okay, so we'll stop here for today, and Mitzvah Hashem carry on next week. Yeah, there's no Shiur Sunday, by the way. Yeah. Yeah.